Victoria Ashford had everything money could buy. Her penthouse apartment sat on the 42nd floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and original paintings worth millions decorated the walls. But none of these treasures meant as much to her as the black Steinway grand piano that sat in the corner of her living room, gathering dust. It had been 3 years since her husband passed away. 3 years since anyone had touched those keys. 3 years since music filled these empty rooms. Victoria walked past it every single day, but she never stopped to look at it anymore. It was easier that way. Easier to bury herself in work, in business deals, in the empire she'd built. She'd become one of the most successful real estate developers in New York City. But success hadn't filled the silence in her home. Today was different, though. Today, Victoria had a problem that needed solving. In exactly 2 weeks, she was hosting her annual charity gala. 300 of New York's wealthiest people would gather in her penthouse, dressed in designer gowns and expensive suits, ready to write big checks for a good cause. Everything had to be perfect. The catering was arranged, the flowers were ordered, the champagne was chilling. But there was one detail she'd overlooked until this morning. The piano needed to be tuned. Victoria stood in her living room, arms crossed, staring at the instrument like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Her assistant, a young woman named Rebecca, frantically scrolled through her phone, trying to find a piano tuner who could come on short notice. "I found someone," Rebecca announced, relief evident in her voice. "He can be here in an hour." "Good," Victoria said, not looking up from her tablet where she was reviewing contracts. "Make sure he doesn't take too long. I have a conference call at 3. What Victoria didn't know was that this ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but ordinary. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Rebecca went to answer it, expecting only the piano tuner. Instead, she found him standing there with Victoria's housekeeper, Rosa Santos. Rosa had worked for Victoria for nearly 8 years, quietly cleaning, organizing, and keeping the penthouse running smoothly. She was a small woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands, the kind of person who became invisible in wealthy homes simply by being too reliable. But today, Rosa wasn't alone. Behind her stood a boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, with dark hair and nervous eyes. He clutched a backpack to his chest like it might protect him from the overwhelming luxury surrounding them. "Mrs. Victoria," Rosa said apologetically, her accent softening her words. "I'm so sorry. The school called. Diego is sick. They sent him home. I have no one to watch him, and I cannot leave work today. I will keep him quiet, I promise. You won't even know he's here." Victoria glanced up from her tablet, her eyes briefly passing over the boy before returning to her screen. "Fine. Just keep him out of the way." Diego Santos had been in this penthouse before, but only in the kitchen and the back hallways where staff belonged. Now, following his mother into the main living room, he felt like he'd stepped into a museum. Everything gleamed. Everything looked expensive and untouchable. His sneakers, worn and scuffed, squeaked slightly on the marble floor, and he cringed at the sound. The piano tuner, an older man with gray hair and gentle hands, was already setting up his tools beside the Steinway. He opened the lid and pressed a few keys. The sound echoed through the room, slightly off-pitch, each note hanging in the air like a question. "The piano is quite out of tune," the tuner said, looking at Victoria. "It hasn't been played in some time, has it?" "No," Victoria replied curtly. "Can you fix it or not?" "Of course, but I'll need to hear it played a bit to understand the full extent of the work needed." "Do you play, Mrs. Ashford?" Victoria's jaw tightened. "Not anymore." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. The tuner looked around, clearly unsure how to proceed. Rebecca shifted nervously. Rosa kept her eyes down, one hand resting protectively on her son's shoulder. Then Victoria made a decision that would change everything. "The boy," she said, gesturing vaguely toward Diego without really looking at him.
Have him play something.
"Just run your fingers over the keys, child. The tuner needs to hear it." Diego's eyes went wide. His mother's hand squeezed his shoulder, a silent question. He looked up at her and she gave him the smallest nod. Permission. The walk from where he stood to the piano bench felt like crossing an ocean. Diego's heart hammered in his chest. His palms were sweating. This wasn't like playing in the basement on his broken keyboard. This was a Steinway. A real Steinway grand piano, the kind he'd only ever seen in videos and dreamed about touching. He sat down on the bench, adjusting his position the way Mr. Chen had taught him. The keys were smooth under his fingertips, cool and perfectly weighted. For a moment he just sat there, overwhelmed by the opportunity and terrified of disappointing his mother. "Well?" Victoria's voice cut through his thoughts. "Go ahead." "Just a few notes." Diego took a breath. Then his fingers found the keys. What came out wasn't a few random notes. It was music. Real music. He began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the pieces he'd been practicing for months on his broken keyboard in the basement. His fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for a boy in worn sneakers and a faded t-shirt. The melody filled the penthouse, soft and achingly beautiful, each note carrying emotion that words couldn't express. Rebecca's clipboard clattered to the floor. The piano tuner stopped what he was doing, his mouth slightly open in surprise. Rosa's eyes filled with tears, watching her son do what he'd never had the chance to do before, play on an instrument worthy of his gift. But Victoria barely looked up from her phone. She was reading an email from a client, only half aware of the sound filling her home. To her, it was just background noise. Pleasant enough, she supposed, but nothing special. Certainly nothing that required her attention. "That's fine," she said after about 30 seconds, waving her hand dismissively. "You can stop now. That's enough for the tuner to work with." Diego's hands froze on the keys. The music stopped abruptly, like a conversation cut off mid-sentence. He looked at his mother, confused. Rosa's tears had turned into something else now, a mix of pride in her son and deep sadness that his extraordinary gift had just been dismissed as ordinary. The piano tuner cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I don't know if you realize—" "Just tune the piano, please," Victoria interrupted, already walking toward her office. "I have that conference call in 20 minutes. Rebecca, make sure I'm not disturbed." And just like that, she was gone. She'd missed it completely. Missed the way the tuner's hands had trembled. Missed the expression on her assistant's face. Missed her housekeeper's tears. Missed the fact that something remarkable had just happened in her living room. Diego sat at the piano bench for a moment longer, his hands still resting on the keys. Then he stood up quietly and followed his mother back to the kitchen, back to where people like them belonged. The piano tuner shook his head slowly as he began his work. In 40 years of tuning pianos, he'd heard a lot of people play. But what he'd just heard from that boy, that was something different. That was something rare. If only someone had been listening. Diego Santos had been 4 years old when he first heard piano music. His mother had taken him to a free concert in Central Park on a summer evening. They'd sat on a blanket on the grass eating sandwiches Rosa had packed, while a pianist performed under the stars. Diego couldn't take his eyes off the man's hands. The way they danced across the keys. The way music poured out like magic. That night he'd asked his mother if he could learn to play. Rosa had smiled sadly and ruffled his hair. Piano lessons cost money they didn't have. They lived in a small apartment in Queens, sharing 2 bedrooms with Rosa's sister and her family. Every dollar Rosa earned went to rent, food, and keeping Diego in school. There was nothing extra, nothing left over for dreams, but Diego couldn't let it go. The music had gotten inside him somehow, and it wouldn't leave. So he did what any determined child would do. He found another way. 2 weeks after that concert, Rosa came home from the thrift store with a surprise. It was an electronic keyboard, old and battered, with several keys that didn't work and a crack down the middle. Someone had thrown it away. Rosa had seen it in the donation pile and thought of her son's bright eyes at that concert. It cost her $12 she couldn't really spare. Diego had cried when she gave it to him. Happy tears. The kind that make a mother's heart both full and broken at the same time. That keyboard became Diego's whole world. He taught himself to play using free videos on the library's computer. He practiced every single day after school, his fingers finding melodies on those broken keys. The F above middle C didn't work, so he learned to play around it. The volume button was stuck on low, so he learned to listen carefully. Where other kids saw limitations, Diego saw possibilities. By the time he was 8, he was playing simple songs. By 10, he was playing Beethoven. By 12, he could play pieces that made grown musicians weep. All of this on a keyboard that belonged in the trash, in a crowded apartment where he had to practice quietly so he wouldn't disturb his aunt and cousins. But Victoria Ashford knew none of this. To her, Rosa was just the housekeeper. Reliable, quiet, and visible. And Diego? He was just the helps kid. Nothing more. What Victoria also didn't know was where Diego spent his afternoons. The basement of her luxury building was a maze of storage rooms, maintenance areas, and forgotten spaces. Most residents never went down there. They had no reason to. But Diego had discovered something wonderful in that basement 2 years ago, and it had changed his life. There was a storage room in the far corner, past the boiler room and behind the extra furniture from the building's lobby renovation. Inside that room, covered with a dusty sheet, sat an old upright piano. It had been left there by a tenant who'd moved out years ago. Too expensive to move and not worth selling. The building superintendent had forgotten it was even there. Diego hadn't forgotten. He'd found it by accident one day while waiting for his mother to finish work. The piano was out of tune, the wood was scratched, and some of the keys stuck. But it was a real piano, an acoustic piano with hammers and strings and a sound that no electronic keyboard could match. That's where he spent every afternoon. While his mother cleaned penthouses 42 floors above, Diego sat in that basement storage room, practicing on an abandoned piano that nobody wanted. He played for hours, losing himself in the music, his fingers building strength and skill on real keys that fought back when he pressed them, and he wasn't alone in his secret. Mr. Chen, the building superintendent, had discovered Diego about 6 months after the boy started playing in the basement. The old man had been checking a water leak when he heard music drifting from the storage room. He'd expected to find a radio. Instead, he found a 10-year-old boy playing Mozart. Mr. Chen was 73 years old. He'd lived in China until he was 30, working as a music teacher in Shanghai before immigrating to America. In his small apartment on the ground floor, he had boxes of old sheet music, concert programs from performances he'd attended, and memories of a life filled with beautiful sounds. He hadn't met anyone who cared about classical music in years. Certainly not in this building full of wealthy people who treated culture like a decoration. But here was this boy, this child of a housekeeper, playing with a passion that Mr. Chen recognized. Real passion. The kind that can't be taught or bought. They'd made a deal, Mr. Chen and Diego. The boy could practice in the storage room as much as he wanted. In return, Mr. Chen would teach him what he knew. He brought Diego his old sheet music. He told him stories about the great pianists he'd heard perform. He showed him techniques and helped him understand the emotion behind the notes. For 2 years, this secret arrangement continued. Diego's playing improved dramatically. Mr. Chen felt young again, like he had a purpose beyond fixing broken elevators and unclogging drains. And Rosa worked upstairs in Victoria's penthouse, grateful that Mr. Chen was kind enough to keep an eye on her son, but never knowing the depth of what was happening in that basement. Diego had dreams. Big dreams that seemed impossible for a boy like him. He wanted to attend the Manhattan Conservatory of Music. It was one of the best music schools in the country, training the next generation of concert pianists and composers. Walking past the conservatory's building on his way to school, Diego would stop and watch through the windows as students practiced in the studios. He'd imagine himself there, learning from real teachers, playing on perfect pianos, surrounded by other people who understood what music meant. But the tuition at Manhattan Conservatory was $60,000 a year. His mother made $32,000 cleaning apartments. The math was simple and heartbreaking. Still, Mr. Chen had encouraged him to try. The conservatory offered one full scholarship each year to a student from a low-income family. Just one. Hundreds of kids applied. But Mr. Chen believed Diego had a chance. A real chance. 3 months ago, Diego had submitted his application. He'd recorded his audition pieces on Mr. Chen's phone in that basement storage room. The recording quality wasn't great, but his playing was. 2 weeks ago, he'd gotten the letter. He'd been selected as a finalist. There would be a live audition in front of the conservatory's admissions committee. The audition was scheduled for next Friday, the same week as Victoria's charity gala, though Diego didn't know that yet. He'd been preparing for months, practicing the same 3 pieces over and over until his fingers could play them in his sleep. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, and Debussy's Clair de Lune. These pieces were his future, his chance, his one shot at the life he dreamed about. Today, sitting at Victoria's Steinway grand piano, he'd played the Chopin, On a real concert piano, an instrument worth more than his mother would earn in 5 years. The keys had responded to his touch like they were alive. The sound had filled the room with a richness he'd never experienced before. For 30 seconds, he'd felt what it would be like to play on a real stage, for a real audience, as a real pianist, and Victoria Ashford had barely looked up from her phone. Rosa knew, though. She'd heard her son play hundreds of times on that broken keyboard at home. She'd heard him practice in the apartment at night when he thought everyone was asleep. But she'd never heard him play on an instrument like that. Never heard what he could really do when given the proper tools. The tears in her eyes weren't just pride. They were grief. Grief for all the opportunities her son would never have. Grief for the genius that the world would probably never recognize because they were poor and invisible. Later that evening, after Victoria had finished her conference call and the piano tuner had left, Rosa gathered her cleaning supplies. Diego sat in the kitchen doing homework, his mind still on those beautiful keys and that incredible sound. Rosa wiped down Victoria's marble countertops and thought about the unfairness of it all. Her son had more talent in his little finger than most people had in their entire bodies. But talent didn't matter if you were born in the wrong place, if you had the wrong last name, if your mother cleaned houses instead of owning them. She'd been saving every extra dollar for 2 years, hoping to help Diego somehow. She had $800 hidden in a box under her bed. It wasn't enough for anything. Not enough for real lessons. Not enough for a decent piano. Not enough to change their lives, but maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to buy him a decent suit for his audition next Friday. That night, Diego practiced on his broken keyboard in the crowded apartment. The F above middle C still didn't work. The sound was still tinny and quiet. But in his mind, he was back at that Steinway, back in that penthouse, back in a world where instruments weren't broken and dreams weren't impossible. He played his audition pieces one more time before bed. In 1 week, everything would change. Either the conservatory would accept him or they wouldn't. Either his life would open up into something beautiful, or the door would close forever. Diego closed his eyes and played, unaware that his destiny and Victoria Ashford's were about to collide in a way neither of them could possibly imagine. The call came at 9 o'clock on Thursday night, exactly 24 hours before Victoria's charity gala. She was reviewing seating arrangements when Rebecca burst into her office, face pale, phone clutched in her trembling hand. "We have a problem," Rebecca said, her voice cracking. "A really big problem." Victoria looked up from her charts, irritation flickering across her face. Everything had been planned perfectly. The flowers were arriving in the morning. The catering staff had confirmed. The champagne was already chilling. What could possibly be wrong? "The pianist," Rebecca continued, barely able to get the words out. "Gregory Hoffman. He collapsed during a rehearsal an hour ago. He's in the hospital." The papers in Victoria's hand fluttered to the desk. Gregory Hoffman was one of the most sought-after pianists in New York City. She'd booked him 6 months ago, paid a $10,000 deposit, and built the entire evening's entertainment around his performance. 300 guests were expecting a world-class concert. Donors were expecting something worthy of their $1 million checks. "Get me another pianist," Victoria said, her voice sharp and controlled. "There must be dozens available in this city." Rebecca's expression told her everything before the words came out. "I've been calling for the past hour. Everyone is booked. It's Friday night. Every concert hall, every private event, every hotel has their pianists scheduled. I've tried 20 different people. Nobody's available on this short notice." Victoria stood up from her desk, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. She'd built her reputation on perfection. Every detail mattered. Every element had to be flawless. A gala without entertainment was unthinkable, unacceptable. "Keep calling," she ordered. "Offer double, triple, whatever it takes." Rebecca nodded and hurried out, phone already pressed to her ear. The next 6 hours were a nightmare. Rebecca called every pianist, every music agency, every contact she could find. The answer was always the same. Nobody was available. One pianist was performing at Carnegie Hall. Another was in Boston. A third was recovering from hand surgery. The list went on and on. By 3 a.m, Victoria was pacing her penthouse in her silk robe, watching the city lights blur through her exhaustion. In 15 hours, guests would start arriving. In 15 hours, she would face humiliation in front of the most influential people in New York. She thought about canceling, but the invitations had gone out months ago. The catering was paid for. The flowers were on their way. And most importantly, her pride wouldn't allow it. Victoria Ashford didn't cancel events. She didn't admit defeat, but she also didn't have a pianist. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in a tiny studio apartment reserved for building staff, Rosa Santos couldn't sleep either. She was thinking about Diego's audition the next day. His big chance. She'd bought him a suit at a discount store, spent hours pressing it until every crease was perfect. His shoes were old but polished until they shined. Everything was ready. Diego was asleep in the small bed they shared, his face peaceful, dreaming probably of pianos and concert halls. Rosa watched him in the dim light and prayed. She wasn't a particularly religious woman, but tonight she prayed harder than she ever had. Please let them see his talent. Please let them give him this chance. Please don't let him end up like me, working 3 jobs and still struggling to pay rent. She thought about earlier that week when Diego had played Victoria's Steinway. The way his fingers had moved across those keys, the sound that had filled that enormous penthouse. For just a moment, Rosa had seen her son's future. She'd seen him on stages and concert halls, his name on programs and posters. Then Victoria had waved her hand and dismissed it all like it was nothing. Rosa felt a familiar anger rise in her chest. She'd worked for wealthy families for 20 years. She'd watched their children get piano lessons, violin lessons, tennis lessons, tutors, and every advantage money could buy. Some of those children had talent. Most didn't, but they all got opportunities. They all got chances. And Diego, with more talent than all of them combined, had to teach himself on a broken keyboard in a crowded apartment. At 6 in the morning, Rosa gave up on sleep. She made coffee and got ready for work. Victoria had asked her to come in early to help prepare for the gala. Rosa needed the overtime pay anyway. She'd work until 3, then rush home to get Diego ready for his 4 o'clock audition. When she arrived at the penthouse, she found chaos. Rebecca was still making phone calls, her voice hoarse and desperate. Victoria stood by the windows, arms crossed, staring out at the city like it had personally betrayed her. Still no pianist? Rosa asked quietly as she set down her cleaning supplies. Rebecca shook her head, near tears. I've called everyone. Literally everyone. There's nobody. Rosa started her work, trying to stay invisible the way she'd learned to do over years of domestic service. But she couldn't help overhearing as Victoria and Rebecca discussed increasingly desperate options. Should they hire a DJ instead? A string quartet? Cancel the whole thing and claim an emergency? None of the options were good. A DJ at a sophisticated charity gala would be ridiculous. A string quartet couldn't fill the space the way a piano could. And canceling would damage Victoria's reputation permanently. Rosa moved through the penthouse quietly, dusting and arranging, while the crisis unfolded around her. She thought about Diego getting ready for his audition. She thought about Mr. Chen, who'd promised to go with him for moral support. She thought about her son's hands on those beautiful piano keys, making music that nobody important had bothered to hear. By noon, the situation hadn't improved. The flowers had arrived, enormous arrangements that filled the penthouse with the scent of roses and lilies. The catering staff was setting up in the kitchen. Everything was perfect except for the one thing that mattered most. Victoria had stopped pacing and started making phone calls herself, reaching out to personal contacts and calling in favors. But even her influence had limits. You couldn't conjure a world-class pianist out of thin air. Rosa took her lunch break in the service hallway, eating a sandwich she'd brought from home. Mr. Chen found her there, looking worried. "How is Diego?" Rosa asked. "Is he nervous?" "Very nervous," Mr. Chen said with a kind smile, "but ready. He's been practicing all morning." "Rosa, I've heard a lot of young pianists in my life. Your son is special, really special. The conservatory would be lucky to have him." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for believing in him, for helping him all this time." Mr. Chen patted her shoulder. "It's been my honor. That boy has a gift. The world needs to hear it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then from inside the penthouse they heard Victoria's voice rising in frustration. Another phone call had ended badly. Another option had fallen through. "She still hasn't found a pianist?" Mr. Chen asked. Rosa shook her head. "She's desperate. The gala is tonight. She has 300 guests coming and no entertainment." Mr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made Rosa's sandwich stick in her throat. "Diego could do it. Rosa stared at him. What? Diego could play at the gala. He knows the repertoire. He's been practicing concert pieces for months. He could do it, Rosa. That's crazy, Rosa whispered. She would never agree. He's just a child. He's my son. She barely looked at him when he played before. But she's desperate now, Mr. Chen pointed out. And Diego is right here. What does she have to lose? Rosa felt her heart hammering. It was an insane idea. Completely insane. Victoria would laugh in her face. Or worse, she'd be offended that Rosa would even suggest it. A housekeeper's son playing at a high society charity gala. It was absurd. But then Rosa thought about Diego's audition. It was at 4 o'clock. If he played at Victoria's gala tonight, he'd miss it. He'd miss his one chance at the conservatory. His one shot at everything he'd been working toward. No, Rosa said firmly. He has his audition. That's more important than Victoria's party. Is it, though? Mr. Chen asked gently. Think about it, Rosa. He'll be playing for 300 of the wealthiest, most influential people in New York. People who donate to arts programs. People who sit on boards of music schools. If even one of them hears what your son can do, it could change everything. Rosa wanted to argue, but doubt was creeping in. What if Mr. Chen was right? What if this was actually a bigger opportunity than the conservatory audition? But what if it wasn't? What if Victoria said no, and then Diego missed his audition for nothing? The minutes ticked by. Rosa finished her lunch but tasted nothing. Her mind was spinning with possibilities and fears. Inside the penthouse, she could hear Victoria's voice getting more strained with each phone call. At 1 o'clock, Rosa made a decision. Her hands were shaking as she knocked on Victoria's office door. Mrs. Ashford? She said quietly. May I speak with you? Victoria looked up, exhausted and frustrated. What is it, Rosa? I'm very busy. Rosa took a deep breath. This was it. The moment that would either change everything or end in disaster. She thought of Diego's face when he'd played that Steinway. She thought of all the years he'd practiced on broken keys. She thought of his dreams. I might have a solution, Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. For your pianist problem. Victoria's expression shifted from irritation to interest. I'm listening, and Rosa spoke the words that would change all of their lives forever. My son Diego, he can play. Victoria stared at Rosa like she'd just suggested they hire a monkey to perform brain surgery. The silence in the office stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Rebecca, who'd been frantically typing on her laptop, stopped and looked up. Your son, Victoria finally said, her voice flat. The boy who played a few notes the other day. Yes, ma'am, Rosa replied, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to stop them from shaking. Diego, he's been training for years. He's very good. He could play tonight. Victoria let out a short, bitter laugh. Rosa, I appreciate the offer, but this is a charity gala. 300 guests, some of the most important people in New York. I can't have a child playing piano like it's a school recital. Rosa felt her face grow hot. She'd expected this reaction, but it still stung. He's not just any child. He's really talented. He's been preparing for an audition at the Manhattan Conservatory. He knows difficult pieces, professional pieces, the conservatory. Victoria's eyebrow raised slightly. And when is this audition? Rosa's voice dropped. Today, at 4 o'clock. So let me understand this correctly, Victoria said, leaning back in her chair. You want your son to skip his audition for one of the best music schools in the country to play at my party instead? When she put it that way, it sounded insane. Rosa's confidence wavered. Maybe this was a terrible idea. Maybe she should just apologize and get back to work, but then Rebecca spoke up. Mrs. Ashford, with all due respect, we don't have any other options. I've called literally everyone. We're out of time. Victoria closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. Rebecca was right. In 4 hours, guests would start arriving. She had no pianist, no backup plan, and no good choices left. Fine, she said finally, her voice tight with reluctance. But I need to hear him play first. If he's not good enough, we're canceling the musical portion of the evening entirely. I won't embarrass myself with amateur hour. Rosa's heart leaped into her throat. He's at home right now, getting ready for his audition. I can call him. Ask him to come. Do it, Victoria said. He has 1 hour to get here, and Rosa, if this goes badly, it's on you. Rosa pulled out her old flip phone with trembling fingers and stepped into the hallway. She dialed Diego's number, praying he'd understand, praying she was making the right choice. Diego answered on the second ring. Mom, is everything okay? Diego, honey, I need you to come to Mrs. Ashford's apartment right now. Bring your sheet music. All of it, but Mom, my audition is in 2 hours. I need to leave for the conservatory soon. Mr. Chen is meeting me at 1:30. Rosa took a deep breath. I know, baby, but something's happened. There's a chance here. A big chance. Can you trust me? There was a long pause. Rosa could almost hear her son thinking, weighing his options, trying to understand what his mother was asking him to do. Okay, Diego said finally. I'll come right now. 40 minutes later, Diego arrived at the penthouse, his backpack full of sheet music and his face full of confusion. He was wearing the suit Rosa had bought him for the audition, navy blue and slightly too big, but he looked handsome. Grown up, like a real performer. Victoria, Rebecca, and Rosa were waiting in the living room. The Steinway sat there like a judge, ready to deliver its verdict. You have 15 minutes, Victoria said to Diego without any greeting or pleasantries. Play whatever you think demonstrates your ability. Convince me you can perform tonight or go home and make your audition. Diego looked at his mother. She gave him an encouraging nod, though her own stomach was twisted in knots. He walked to the piano, set his sheet music on the stand, and sat down. His hands were shaking. This wasn't like playing in the basement for Mr. Chen. This wasn't even like his brief performance a few days ago. This was an audition, a real one. Everything depended on the next 15 minutes. Diego closed his eyes and thought about all those hours in the basement. All those nights on his broken keyboard. All those dreams of playing on a real stage for a real audience. Then he opened his eyes, placed his fingers on the keys, and began. He started with Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. It was a powerful piece, dark and dramatic, with thundering chords that filled the entire penthouse. His fingers attacked the keys with a confidence that seemed impossible for a 13-year-old boy. The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves, each note precise and purposeful. Victoria's phone, which had been in her hand, slowly lowered to her lap. Rebecca's mouth fell open. Rosa stood against the wall, tears already streaming down her face. When Diego finished the Rachmaninoff, he immediately transitioned into Debussy's Clair de Lune. The contrast was stunning. From dark and powerful to light and ethereal, his fingers danced across the keys like they were made of air. The melody floated through the room, delicate and heartbreaking and beautiful. Victoria stood up from her chair, moving closer to the piano without realizing it. This wasn't possible. This child, her housekeeper's son in his too big suit and worn shoes, was playing like he'd been trained at a conservatory his entire life. No, not just trained. He was playing with something deeper than training. He was playing with soul. Diego finished with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece he'd played briefly days before. But this time Victoria was listening, really listening, and what she heard shook something loose inside her that had been frozen for 3 years. The music was gentle and sad and hopeful all at once. It reminded her of her husband, of late nights when he'd played this same piano, of everything she'd lost and buried and tried to forget. When the final note faded, nobody spoke. The silence was complete. Diego sat at the piano bench, his hands still resting on the keys, waiting. His heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. Victoria walked closer, studying him like she was seeing him for the first time. This wasn't the invisible boy who'd shuffled through her apartment earlier that week. This was an artist, a real musician. She'd been in rooms with famous pianists, had attended countless concerts and performances. What she'd just heard was extraordinary. How long have you been playing? Victoria asked, her voice softer than anyone had heard it in months. Since I was 4, Diego said quietly. I taught myself mostly, and Mr. Chen helped me. Mr. Chen? The building superintendent? Diego nodded. He used to be a music teacher in China. He's been giving me lessons for 2 years. Victoria shook her head slowly, trying to process this information. Talent like this had been in her building the entire time, in her own home, and she'd walked past it without noticing. Rebecca was frantically typing on her phone. Mrs. Ashford, this could actually work. More than work. This could be incredible. But Victoria wasn't thinking about the gala anymore. She was thinking about the look on Diego's face when he played. The pure joy mixed with desperate hope. She was thinking about Rosa, who'd worked for her for 8 years and never mentioned that her son was a prodigy. She was thinking about what it must be like to have this much talent and no opportunities. No access. No way forward, Diego, Victoria said, surprising everyone, including herself. If you play tonight, you'll miss your conservatory audition. That's a big sacrifice. Why would you even consider it? Diego glanced at his mother, then back at Victoria. My mom thinks this might be a better opportunity, that the right people might hear me play. And what do you think? Diego was quiet for a moment. I think I've been practicing for that audition for 6 months. I think it might be my only chance to go to a real music school. But I also think my mom has worked really hard for me my whole life. And if she says this is important, then I trust her. Something cracked in Victoria's chest. This boy was willing to give up his dream because his mother asked him to. Because he trusted her. When was the last time anyone had trusted Victoria like that? She made a decision then, one that surprised her more than anyone. You'll play tonight, Victoria said. But not as a replacement or a backup plan. You'll play as the featured performer. I'll introduce you properly. And tomorrow I'll personally call the conservatory and explain why you missed your audition. I'll make sure they give you another chance, Rosa gasped. Mrs. Ashford, you don't have to. Yes, I do, Victoria interrupted. Rebecca, I want programs printed in the next 2 hours. Diego Santos, featured pianist. Get his name right. And Rosa, take the rest of the day off. Help your son prepare. Diego looked like he might cry. Thank you, Mrs. Ashford, I won't let you down. I know you won't, Victoria said. And for the first time in 3 years, she smiled. Really smiled. As Rosa and Diego left to prepare, Rebecca turned to her boss. That was really kind of you. Victoria walked back to the window, looking out at the city. It wasn't kind. It was right. There's a difference. In 6 hours, Diego Santos would walk into a room full of wealthy strangers and play the most important concert of his life. In 6 hours, everything would change. But neither Diego nor Victoria knew just how much. The guests started arriving at 7 o'clock, stepping out of limousines and town cars onto the sidewalk below Victoria's building. Designer gowns, tailored tuxedos, jewelry that cost more than most people's houses. They rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor, champagne glasses already in hand, ready for an evening of elegance and charity. None of them knew what they were about to witness. Diego stood in Victoria's guest bedroom, staring at himself in the mirror. His suit looked better now that Rosa had adjusted it, taking in the waist and hemming the pants. His shoes were polished. His hair was combed, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. You're going to be amazing, Rosa whispered, adjusting his tie one more time even though it was already perfect. Just play like you always do. Like nobody's watching. Like it's just you and the music. There are 300 people out there, Mom, Diego said, his voice cracking. 300 people who probably think I don't belong here. Rosa cupped his face in her hands. You belong anywhere there's music. Remember that? Mr. Chen poked his head into the room. He'd come up from his apartment, dressed in the only suit he owned, pressed and clean for this special occasion. They're ready for you, he said gently. Diego took a deep breath. This was it. No turning back now. In the main living room, the guests mingled and chatted, completely unaware that their entertainment had changed. They discussed stock markets and real estate deals, art gallery openings, and upcoming vacations to Europe. The Steinway sat in the corner waiting. Victoria stood near the piano, her own nerves surprising her. She'd hosted hundreds of events, spoken in front of thousands of people, negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But right now, waiting to introduce a 13-year-old boy to her most important guests, she felt genuinely anxious. What if they didn't understand? What if they saw this as desperate or inappropriate? What if they judged her for putting a housekeeper's son on stage? But then she remembered Diego's face when he played that afternoon. The pure, unfiltered joy, the undeniable talent, and she realized something important. She didn't care what they thought anymore. Rebecca dimmed the lights slightly and tapped a champagne glass with a fork. The conversation slowly died down. 300 faces turned toward Victoria expectantly. Good evening, everyone, Victoria began, her voice steady and clear. Thank you all for being here tonight. As you know, we gather every year to support arts education in our city's public schools. Tonight's cause is especially close to my heart for reasons that will become clear in a moment. She paused, looking around the room at these people she'd known for years. Colleagues, competitors, friends and enemies, and everyone in between. I'm going to be honest with you, Victoria continued. Our scheduled performer had a medical emergency yesterday. I spent hours trying to find a replacement, and in my desperation I discovered something that's been right under my nose for years. I discovered that genius doesn't care about money or status or connections. It simply exists waiting to be recognized. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the typical opening speech. Tonight you're going to hear from a young pianist named Diego Santos. He's 13 years old. He's never performed at a formal concert. He's never attended a prestigious music school. In fact, he taught himself to play on a broken keyboard and an abandoned piano in our building's basement. His mother, Rosa, has worked as my housekeeper for 8 years, and I'm ashamed to say that until 2 days ago, I had no idea her son was a prodigy. The murmurs grew louder. Some guests looked intrigued. Others looked uncomfortable. A few looked downright skeptical. "I'm not asking you to lower your expectations," Victoria said firmly. "I'm asking you to raise them. Because what you're about to hear is the most authentic, pure musical talent I've encountered in my lifetime. Ladies and gentlemen, Diego Santos." Diego walked out from the hallway, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. The sea of faces staring at him was overwhelming. He could see the doubt in their eyes. A kid in a suit that didn't quite fit. The help's son. What could he possibly have to offer them? He sat at the Steinway, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment he froze. Stage fright threatened to swallow him whole. Then he found his mother's face in the crowd. She was standing against the wall where the service staff belonged. Tears already in her eyes, her hand pressed to her heart. Next to her stood Mr. Chen, smiling encouragingly. Diego closed his eyes and let everything else fall away. The fancy apartment, the wealthy guests, the pressure, all of it disappeared until there was only the piano and the music inside him that needed to come out. He began with Rachmaninoff, just like he had that afternoon. His fingers flew across the keys, powerful and precise. The opening chords crashed through the penthouse like thunder, demanding attention. Within seconds, every conversation stopped. Every skeptical expression shifted to surprise. This wasn't a child playing piano. This was a musician commanding an instrument. Diego poured everything into his performance. All the years of practicing on broken keys. All the nights dreaming of this moment. All the love his mother had shown him. Working 3 jobs so he could have sheet music and a quiet place to practice. All the patience Mr. Chen had given him, teaching him for free because he believed in him. The music swelled and crashed, delicate and powerful, joyful and heartbreaking all at once. Diego moved through his pieces with a confidence that seemed to grow with each note. He was born to do this. Everyone in the room could feel it. Victoria watched from the side, her hand covering her mouth. She'd heard him play that afternoon, but this was different. This was Diego unleashed, no longer nervous or holding back. This was what happened when talent finally got the stage it deserved. When Diego transitioned into Debussy's Clair de Lune, several women in the audience wiped their eyes. The melody floated through the room like moonlight, gentle and achingly beautiful. Some guests had pulled out their phones, recording this unexpected performance. Among the crowd stood Jonathan Price, one of the wealthiest philanthropists in New York, and a major donor to arts programs throughout the city. He leaned over to his wife and whispered, "That boy is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary." Next to him, Patricia Lee, who sat on the board of 3 different music schools, including the Manhattan Conservatory, had stopped drinking her champagne entirely. She was transfixed, her trained ear recognizing something rare, something special. Diego finished his performance with a piece he'd added at the last moment, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece he'd played for Victoria days ago when she hadn't been listening. But now everyone was listening. The room was completely silent except for the piano, every person hanging on every note. When the final chord faded into silence, nobody moved. The moment hung there perfect and complete. Then Jonathan Price started clapping, slowly at first, then faster. Others joined in. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause, not polite charity applause, real applause. The kind that comes from genuine amazement. Diego stood up from the piano bench, overwhelmed. Some guests were on their feet. Others were wiping tears. All of them were clapping. Victoria walked over to him and did something that shocked everyone, including herself. She hugged him. Right there in front of 300 people, she hugged Rosa's son like he was her own. "You were magnificent," she whispered. The rest of the evening was a blur. Guest after guest approached Diego, asking about his training, his influences, his dreams. Jonathan Price handed Rosa his card and said he wanted to discuss setting up a music education fund in Diego's name. Patricia Lee from the conservatory pulled Victoria aside. "That boy missed his audition today, didn't he?" Patricia asked. Victoria nodded, ready to explain, to ask for another chance. "Don't worry about it," Patricia said with a smile. "I think we just heard all the audition we need. Full scholarship starting next semester. I'll have my office call you on Monday." Rosa, standing nearby, heard this and actually had to sit down. Full scholarship. Her baby was going to the Manhattan Conservatory. Mr. Chen found Diego surrounded by admirers and caught his eye across the room. The old man was crying openly, not caring who saw. For 2 years, he'd known this boy was special. Finally, the world knew it too. By the time the last guest left at midnight, Victoria's charity had raised $3 million, double what she'd expected. But more importantly, something had shifted in the room. In her. In everyone who'd witnessed what they'd witnessed. Diego sat on the piano bench, exhausted and happy, while Rosa packed up his sheet music. Victoria approached them with 2 glasses of sparkling cider. "To new beginnings," she said. Handing them each a glass, they clinked glasses, an unlikely trio brought together by circumstance and music. "I'm going to start a foundation," Victoria said suddenly, "for young musicians from families who can't afford lessons or instruments. Real support, real opportunities. And Diego, I'd like you to help me run it someday, when you're ready." Diego looked at his mother, then at Victoria, then at the piano that had changed everything. "I'd like that," he said softly. Victoria smiled, really smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. Connection. Hope. The next morning, videos of Diego's performance started appearing online. Within a week, they'd been viewed millions of times. Within a month, he'd been invited to perform at venues across the country. But Diego never forgot where he started. The basement piano. The broken keyboard, his mother's sacrifices, Mr. Chen's kindness. And he never forgot the moment when someone finally listened. Years later, Diego Santos would become one of the most celebrated pianists of his generation. He'd perform at Carnegie Hall, tour internationally, record albums that won awards. But he'd always say his most important performance was the one in Victoria Ashford's penthouse. When a room full of people learned that genius doesn't care about privilege, it only cares about being heard. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to finally listen.